Welcome to the fourth presentation this year of the Carl Jasper Society of North America. There were two presentations in Philadelphia at the APA Eastern Division. This is the second one here at the Pacific meeting in Vancouver. Welcome to our YouTube audience. If you're not familiar with Carl Jaspers or the Carl Jaspers Society, first of all, here's a good book you can read. Biography of Carl Jaspers by Suzanne Kirkbride. There was a nice session on her book some years back. If you Google the Carl Jasper Society of North America, you can find information about joining it. The Society also has a journal, Existence, an international journal in philosophy, religion, politics, and the arts, which comes out regularly. So if this is your first encounter with Carl Jaspers, we hope it won't be your last. Tonight's session is titled Philosophy, Psychopathology, and Neuroscience, Contemporary Empirical and Interpretive Issues and Debates. I'm Carlin Romano, Professor of Philosophy and Humanities at Ursinus College. We have three speakers tonight, and we expect the session to run for about 2 hours. Thanks again to the Carl Jasper Society for hosting this. And our first speaker is going to be Aaron Mishara, professor at the Chicago School of Professional Psychology. And unless your title has changed, I have Carl Jaspers and the early Heidelberg School, Self-Disturbances in Schizophrenia. So,
thank you very much.
Yeah.
Okay. So what follows was inspired or is inspired by a remark by Helmut, Dr. Helmut Wautischer. He raised a question in an earlier session of the society at this conference. What is the relationship between brain and personhood, or being a self? Today, I will discuss the application of Jasper's phenomenological method to psychiatry, especially with regard to delusions and the so-called self-disturbances, or Ich-Störungen, in schizophrenia, is precisely this issue of how to resolve the tension between brain and person. Now, if I understood Helmut's question, it was sort of along the lines, what happens to personhood with neurosurgery? What I will call here a lesion model. That is, if one lesions brain areas one after another until the function one is investigating is removed, we then understand what areas might be implicated in the function. And this kind of lesioning is not just experiments. It could be from a neurological disease or neuropsychiatric diseases, as well as what's now called temporary lesioning through transcranial magnetic stimulation. So let us assume if after a certain extent of lesions or dimension, a certain point of compromised cortical function, such that the person is no longer supported, no longer a person. So then that would give us some idea of what a person is. So although efforts are underway to test for minimal self-awareness in the minimally conscious and vegetative states using neuroimaging and electrophysiological experiments, Schiff, the clinical researcher, reports that he uses a bedside behavioral test of pinching the patient. If the patient then reaches and grabs the examiner's arm or hand, this may indicate the minimal responsiveness necessary to predict favorable prognosis or recovery of conscious functioning following therapeutic intervention. One intervention is the direct activation of the thalamic neurons through deep brain stimulation, which allows for which has a stronger impact on driving excitation within the cortex and different areas of the cortex that can talk with one another, rather than the cortical projections themselves. Now, the tactile mapping of the pinch was right here, and the patient has to know that to grab the person's hand, requires topographic bodily mappings in the sensory cortices, what's called S1, S2, and those areas, to be able to accurately grasp the examiner's arm. And on the other hand, the patient also has to have a egocentric motor coordinate system to know exactly where to grasp the experimenter who is pinching him. So this requires minimal cortical mediation. That is, minimal self-awareness of the patient with the minimally conscious states is reflected by a perception-action cycle, which requires an embodied shifting of external and internal experiences of self as mediated by this perception-action cycle. I will say as an aside, this actually challenges some of the leading current views of self-disturbance in schizophrenia as reduced pre-reflective self-awareness as a passive self-affection, which I will enter into a little bit below. In his General Psychopathology of 1913, Jaspers was the first to introduce phenomenological method to psychiatry. I will contend that the problem of the person as being a self and its relation to neurobiology and schizophrenia is indirectly reflected in Jaspers' own phenomenological analysis of delusions in schizophrenia. It has been suggested that Jaspers originated the self-disturbance concept, in German, the Ich-Störungen, but although Jaspers describes phenomena related to the self-disturbances, the SDs, such as passivity experiences, delusions of motor control, being influenced by outer external powers, inserted, withdrawn, blocked, or broadcasted thoughts, he did not systemize them under the SD's concept. I will not discuss the history of the self-disturbances here, but save that for another occasion. What I would like to address is how Jaspers' methodology allows for the inclusive consideration of both brain neurobiology and the self as person. Through his textbook, the General Psychopathology, the Allgemeine Psychopathologie, published in 1913, and his early psychiatric writings at the time, Jaspers is celebrated as introducing rigorous method and order into psychiatry. The German psychiatrist Gerd Huber, who was a student of Kurt Schneider, observed Jaspers nevertheless contends that, quote, the entire person is not graspable through a scientific discipline. In fact, Jaspers himself writes in 1910, we experience in the other a unity which we cannot define but only experience. My translation. How do we reconcile these two approaches in Jaspers, the view that certain psychiatric disorders of schizophrenia are organically based, and at the same time that the self which is impacted cannot be comprehended by the same approaches that we study in the neurobiology? I will just make a brief aside of some of the discussion at that time of the phenomenology of person, and certainly one of the leading people doing that was Max Schaeler, who lived until 1928. He proposed a ethics based on value theory, Wertethik, and specifically the incontrovertible value of the person to counter the formalism of Kant's ethics. Our experience of the humanity of another person whom we encounter is not given simply through adhering to any formal principle. Something more is required. Instead, there is a way in which the other person and our feelings regarding their vulnerability or our empathy with their situation touches us and moves us to act compassionately. And I think of Levinas as another phenomenological philosopher in the French tradition who also has a similar view. For Schaeler, any objectifying attitude makes the person immediately transcendent, and this is the case both for oneself and others. Thus, we cannot, in a way, objectify ourselves either in our own personhood. This should be self-evident, since no act can become the object of another act, according to Schaeler, and such mental activity itself can never become object in a subsequent reflection, which tries to call it back to mind. An act is never an object for Schaeler. Hence, the person as source of own mental activity cannot be objectified by oneself or another. The person as the executor of acts is the most hidden of all phenomena, according to Schaeler. The person lives existence precisely in the experiencing. We do not directly experience the person or the other through our perception of their body, but only through our own emotive experience of their value or dignity as persons. That is, we need to be open to experiencing the other's value to be able to experience this value emotively. Maybe I'll just say a little bit about Gadamer, that following Schaeler, the philosopher Gadamer emphasized that the other's worth is not given through perception, or what is called cold cognition, but instead engages the embodied response of openness to the other in an unfolding dialogue. Gadamer proposes that open dialogue anticipates a totality which both conversants share, but to which neither has full access. And Gadamer describes how we apply in our understanding of others a preliminary or anticipatory grasp of completeness, die Anwendung des Vorgriffs der Vollkommenheit, or the totality. So let me now return back to Jaspers. And when Jaspers wrote his 1913 textbook, I mean, not only were these discussions of Schaeler about the person, certainly others also around at that time, but there was also the 19th century debate between the Geisteswissenschaften, the human historical sciences, and the Naturwissenschaften, or natural sciences. And it was still current, and in part, as Professor Bormuth suggested yesterday, partially through the presence and influence of Max Weber. As can be seen from this figure, and I don't know how it's going to be visible to all here, but at least you'll get a general idea. A figure that I published with Paolo Fusorpoli. I made a diagram, we made a diagram, can be seen in this figure, of two directions. One going to the center of the figure, which I call explanation, and the other going away from the center of the figure to the outskirts of these circles, or oblong shapes, understanding. And what I want to put down in the very center of this is physis, physics. The next level, and that would be like molecular the basis of neurotransmission, but the next level would be bios, or life. So that would be, for example, neurotransmission and brain. The next level I'd like to call psyche, or breath, as it was in the Greek, and then move up to polos and cosmos. So polis is the political organization, the social organization of the society, and I will include in that the historical sciences. And then above that, I will call the encompassing, what encompasses everything else. And these are two methodologies. One is for the human historical sciences, which is contextual. It moves from the very basic up to the more and more contextual. The other is the natural sciences. Which moves from the outer circles ever more to smaller and smaller parts. Natural sciences proceed in terms of the classical reductionist hierarchy, from history and sociology to psychology to biology, chemistry, and physics. They generally proceed from rather larger nebulous wholes to seek out explanatory relationships among ever smaller abstract parts of these wholes. Conversely, understanding of the historical human sciences is contextual by situating parts in ever greater wholes, even if these totalities are ultimately unavailable to the individual perspective, but transcend or encompass it. Each discipline requires an abstraction, or what Husserl calls an idealization, a naming of objects or entities within its domain or discipline, which in turn excludes objects from neighboring disciplines. And then there are fuzzy areas between disciplines involving destabilizing relationships within interdisciplinary vocabulary and concepts. Each level is provisional, but also necessary abstraction that presupposes the greater whole from which it was abstracted. And Husserl, as Husserl puts it, we can access a lower level domain of research objects by provisionally abstracting them from their context, what he calls the life world. Thus, the movement of levels from neurochemistry, altered dopaminergic neurotransmission in this case, to systems neuroscience, what we call their aberrant salience, to the psychopathology. And this paper was talking about something called the Truman Syndrome, which is based on the Truman story, which involves an individual, Jim Carrey, as can be seen in this picture if one can see it, who suddenly discovers that he has cameras on his everyday life, and this turns out to be a kind of present-day delusion. Okay, so each level is a provisional step and presupposes the greater whole from which it's abstracted. Jaspers emphasizes the methods of the natural and human historical sciences are opposed but also interdependent. Jaspers incorporates the methods of explanation and understanding in his conceptualization of primary delusions, what he calls ectus bon, or genuine delusions, as reflecting an underlying neurobiological process which ultimately impacts the self as person. And the way that we distinguish primary genuine delusions from merely delusion-like ideas is that the clinician attempts empathic understanding of the primary delusion by trying to understand the life historical context or psychological motivations or other understandable motivations that has led to this delusion. But what happens, but is unable to access the experiential source of the delusion. As Grula, the follower of Jaspers, says, the patient just knows it. They can't tell you why, they just know it. So the new or primary in the delusion cannot be derived from some prior experience, motivation, inner psychological connectedness, which I will call Dilthey Zusammenhänge, the interconnectedness or context of experience, and in more recent Bayesian models, which I won't have too much time, but we're trying to introduce that as well, as priors as context to how we make inferences about states, hidden states in the world. Without context, making the patient's behaviors or statements understandable, the clinician's empathic understanding falters, and the clinician experiences the limits of their own understanding. And as ununderstandable, context not available through empathic perspective taking, primary delusion indicates underlying neurobiological disease process. And why, and so I would say the old self dies, and a double arises from the self born around which the new delusions circulate. There is a new self. In the shift from what is called prodromal delusional mood or atmosphere, and that's this kind of aberrant salience that details in the environment suddenly seem very significant. They seem to speak out to one, to call out to one that there's some special meaning in the way these pens are arranged next to this, and it sort of reminds me of a Flemish painting, and if it does that, then it must refer to my ancestry, et cetera, et cetera. It generates efforts to try to explain why I'm having this very strange feeling. People call it depersonalization, derealization, but that may not really capture this aberrant salience that we think is mediated by hyper-dopaminergic signaling, going to different areas that show a prediction error that captivates the attention to try to understand why these details stand out so much. So in the shift from prodromal, that's prior to psychosis, delusional mood, to the primary delusions, which are experienced as a kind of revelation in the psychosis. As Jaspers writes already in 1910, the previous personality may all at once completely disappear, leading to an entirely new personality as developing analogously to the original one. making all previous autobiographical memories and narratives irrelevant to the new state and the new person that's born in the psychotic process. So the neurobiological process interrupts the development of personality with something completely foreign. The patient may develop a double in the form of a shadowy presence. Jaspers uses the term leibhafte Bewusstheit, but what today we call feeling of a presence, just sensing that a presence is there. And Jaspers says that this may mediate the feelings of hallucinations that follow, and the feelings of external control by a double. So now, as Jaspers' primary delusions that I just described, which we cannot understand but only explain, because there's no context to them anymore, only explain them by referring them back to this neurobiological disease process, so also with the self-disturbances. They involve a disruption of understandable context through aberrant salience, again, putatively through dopaminergic signaling or other signaling of prediction error. Similarly to primary delusions, self-disorders or self-disturbances are ununderstandable to the interviewing clinician. So that's clear. So both the delusions and these strange reports of thought insertion, thought withdrawal, loss of self, feeling controlled by an external double or self, these are clearly ununderstandable to the clinician. However, the self-disorders or self-disturbances, and here it's no longer Jaspers but others, are also ununderstandable to the patient. Inserted thoughts, for example, concern harmless, mundane circumstances, yet the patient knows precisely which thoughts are inserted. The idea to go to a concert tonight is suddenly experienced as foreign, as being inserted by a foreign agent. But that was just the thought before. Oh, I like music. Why is this thought inserted and the one before not? Well, again, aberrant salient signaling that makes that stand out. Similarly to the aberrant salience of prodromal delusional mood, the self-disturbances disrupt the online contribution of past experience in shaping the inner continuity of consciousness and self. Coming from nowhere, the made experiences, gemachte experiences, thought insertion, thought withdrawal, thought broadcasting, or other SDs disrupt goal processing. What the person was about to do, suddenly a voice interrupts them, or the thought insertion. The patient, him or herself, is surprised, possibly generating what in today more recent modeling is called a prediction error signal in hierarchical Bayesian modeling. Due to the interruption by the made or influenced perceptions, movements, thoughts, volitions, there is a reduction of what the patient expects. Das Vorschauende. From moment to moment, there is only the compelling sensory evidence of now, aberrant salience. As Meyer Gross writes, my translation, no temporal order prevails. Each sensory impression is equally valued, replacing its predecessor. Experience of time and memory encoding. Oh, okay. So I'm just right at the end. Is also disrupted, and Grula writes, primary delusion has nothing to do with the patient's earlier experiences. So I think I will close there. There's much more to say. I hadn't said much about how this view does not necessarily support certain models today or interpretations of these self-disturbances as reduced pre-reflective self-awareness, as ipseity or passive self-affection, in part because these constructs can neither be demonstrated or studied, because every time we try to reflect back in time about this pre-reflective self-awareness, there is an observer effect where we retrospectively insert the very thing or construct that we were looking for, and phenomenological reflection, in my view, does not support this particular construct, and I've turned to the historians of the actual historical figures who developed the Ich-Störung concept to suggest another mechanism, kind of splitting with aberrant salience. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Aaron. So we're going to take 15 minutes now about for questions.
Thank you very much for that
comments.
paper. I thought it was quite good. So I have one question related to the ununderstandable bit, where on the one hand, actually maybe I have two questions. On the one hand, the psychiatrist or the doctor finds the delusions ununderstandable once they've reached a certain point of sort of inaccessibility. But then you also notice that on the side of the patient also finds their own delusions ununderstandable in the sense of thought insertion just sort of comes out of nowhere, right?
Self-disturbance.
Yeah, self-disturbances. So I was wondering, so two questions. One is, so is there still meaning in the patient even having these thought insertions? Are they still meaningful? Sort of from a intentional sense, like you use the sense of I want to go to the concert. So even if that thought was inserted, is it still like a meaningful thought? And then the other question I have is, maybe you want to answer them at different times.
Well, let me just address that because I had immediate thought when you said that, and I don't want to lose it actually. So yes, meaningful, but not in terms of the content. The desire to go to the concert, yes, there was a desire to go to the concert, and maybe the patient will even own to that, that there was the desire, but that was not put in his head, this thought. What is significant was that it was put in his head. That's very salient. So that has tremendous meaning for the patient.
Okay, good, thanks. And the other one related to R.D. Laing's work. So I know this is a bit of a question of whether or not R.D. Laing has put to rest the idea of the ununderstandability of these psychosis. So in, where he takes his book in like Divided Self, for instance, and then others, he has interviews with patients with schizophrenia and then tries to show how these interviews, they're actually making sense and how it's just sort of, you have to interpret them differently than the way we interpret sort of everyday conversation. But do you still think that, because in another place in the General Psychopathology, Asper says that these ununderstandable bits lead us sort of to an existential moment where we notice that everyone's character is ultimately ununderstandable in a certain sense, like once we reach far enough. So is R.D. Laing actually refuting Jaspers, or?
Let me say something to that. So one of the things that, so Jaspers himself doesn't really systematically develop the self-disturbances. That's other people who knew Jaspers' work. Oh gosh, now I forgot what I was going to say. Oh yes. And then in fact later, Kurt Schneider, for one thing, they wanted to debate psychoanalysis. So they were saying it's not the content that's motivated. That's not what's important, although the content can reflect all kinds of things and you can certainly get lost in the content and analyze it. That's not what's important, and that's not what's ununderstandable, though often it is. But that's not what really is understandable. For what Kurt Schneider says later, much later, he says, it's the fact that there are delusions at all. That's what's ununderstandable. So it's more the form or the how or the Zosign maybe, rather than the content that is ununderstandable.
Okay.
And that's often misunderstood itself, that particular point.
I should say that was Daniel Adset from Marquette, who will be speaking later. Other questions? And we're a small group. We're open to the audience also. Anybody out there?
One question picking up concerning the beginning of your talk, right? When you referred to that question that I posed yesterday. So do I understand it correctly that the success of the neurosurgery is verified by the patient's ability to pinch your arm? Leaving out, other steps, right?
Yes, right. So that's the minimally conscious states, and Nicholas Schiff, who uses a bedside technique to test how much cortical connectivity is available to the patient in a really quick test, which is called the pinch test, and whether the patient grabs, grabs that person's hand and knows where to grab it, clearly involving cortical processing. And that for Schiff is a good prognostic indicator that this person will respond to whatever aggressive or less aggressive treatments he decides to use with these minimally conscious patients. So it's kind of just a kind of quick test, but it's showing, and I argue that it's a perception-action cycle that requires cortical communication to do that. So that's a prognostic indicator.
Is then there any concern about the integrity of personhood, the quality of life, the difference between being a more or less autonomous agent, whatever that might mean, as opposed to being bedridden and totally dependent on care and incapacitated in one's cognitive ability? What kind of person is left? In the neuropsychiatric perspective, what kind of person is left?
Well, you're absolutely right to emphasize the issue of quality of life, because that's certainly one of the cost-benefit analyses of doing interventions, is to consider the quality of life that would result. So that's another prognostic indicator of recovery. Okay.
Other comments from the panel? No? Or the audience? Otherwise, I'll ask a question, which may frighten everybody. I'm not a great expert in this area, so forgive me if this question seems poorly articulated, but in my own reading of neuroscience, neurophilosophy, and so on, Daniel Dennett, people like that, it seems to me one of the big issues still is how we coordinate the words we have had throughout culture for these psychological states or psychological categories, like person, like self, like delusion, with the science.
Right.
And I'm curious, I mean, if you could imagine, Jaspers today still with us, understanding the science that has been reached at this point, what would he think about that? Because I don't know that this is a phrase in the field, but I'll coin it, non-correlatives, non-coordinationists, people who think it's just not possible to coordinate the historic cultural terms with the science, or who think that's almost a matter of cultural politics, how we do that, how we're going to decide what's one self or two selves or three selves, and so on.
So there's a passage somewhere in Jaspers, I believe, where he suggests that the liberal arts or historical sciences, human sciences, be part of the psychiatrist's training. And as I recall at Yale, there was somebody, I believe it was in medicine, I wasn't sure whether it was psychiatry, but brought his students to the museum to look at paintings, to help develop observational skills. And I think what Jaspers is saying, or as I see it, these two things, explanation and understanding, can never really be separated from one another. They're in dialectical relationship. Even as you're interviewing the client, say, aha, that seems to me to be a primary delusion. The way to explain it is through a neurobiological process, but I also understand the context. I also understand the patient's ethnic context or cultural context or worldview, etc., as context for understanding what else the client is saying, and I still relate to the client as a person. So.
I think the word I was thinking of, correlationists, people who think that there can be perfect correlations, or that somehow as a culture we'll agree on the correlations, and those who think they'll be very context dependent, they may depend on cultural background and so on. Our second presentation is by Stephen Erickson, professor of philosophy and the E. Wilson Lyon Professor in the Humanities at Pomona College, and it's titled Reflections on Transformation.
What I'll be talking to you about is part of a larger project which I call thresholding. And one of the underlying motivators of this project, which has been going on in my thinking for some time, is that philosophy and psychoanalytic thinking need further and future conversation with each other. One reason I believe this to be true is that various medical models of a scientific sort are very, very helpful within limits. But what I'll be reflecting on with you are things that perhaps go beyond those limits and need a certain careful reflection and exploration if we're to sort them out over the next however much time, decades or more. Transformation is in my title, and I think the notion of transformation is important, not reducible to the notion of transition. Now, for what I will call the conflict model for understanding transformation, and I'll be distinguishing a conflict model from a deficit model, actually is an historical matter, and this is not explored very much in our particular time. Hegel is helpful for understanding conflict orientation toward transformation. Much of what he has there is caught up in a certain historical mode, and in a certain set of circumstances it needs to be extracted. But when Hegel says recurrently, for example, in the Phenomenology of Spirit, es ist mit ihm nicht ernst, that there's therapeutic value in thinking through and reflecting on the settings in which that notion arises. But quickly to move from conflict to deficit, remember I say I think there are two fundamental ways of understanding transformation. One, a conflict notion, the other a deficit notion. And here I have in mind the notion of voids in human life, of something being missing in human life. The historical philosophical basis for reflecting on that comes, I believe, from Kant. It involves a distinction between a spontaneous faculty we have and a receptive faculty we have. And I think that if we look beyond Kant's sense-bound epistemology, we can understand how there can be openness not in terms simply of space and time, converted as Kant converts them from Newton, but there can be an openness in the sense of an openness to meaning, perhaps very fundamental, so fundamental that spontaneity may absolutely require it to be able to function. There are challenges. There is a challenge in finding a non-platitudinous way of talking about openness to meaning. And I think on the therapeutic level, it would be realized that it is a demanding activity, surely, to think about openness to meaning, demanding on therapists and on their patients and or clients. And in this regard, and I will be speaking rapidly, hoping to get to the goal line in time, there are important things to say that arise out of Nietzsche on the one hand and Heidegger on the other about the notion of deficit or vacuum or something being missing. And these are really the core notions I will hope to get to as soon as I can. Transformation is a heady word, and it's referent a somewhat opaque event. We do know, or think we do, that transformations occur. There is considerable controversy, however, over how and why they come about. Jaspers remarks that a living reality within and regarding the world forced the beginning of a major human transformation. Here we're talking about the advent of the axial age. And then in order to better understand this living reality, some transformation within the human had to take place. And of course, Jaspers mentions different ways in which this occurred, involving Socrates, Buddha, Confucius. We could name other figures, among them, of course, people like Plato. With regard to transformation, it is also true that something remains very much itself, though we are willing to say and must say with respect to transformation that it involves perhaps a radical change, and there coming to be something significantly different. There's also something that remains the same, yet again becomes substantially different than it was before. And of course, that's a paradoxical notion, needing always to be thought through in particular contexts. This difference, to say that in transformation something becomes quite different, is not construed as marginal. It is not at some identifiable periphery. On the contrary, when transformation occurs, something quite essential and integral to what is transformed is believed to have taken place. That which has been transformed is somehow fundamentally changed, yet it also remains identifiable as basically the same entity that it was before its transformation occurred. This is genuinely baffling, so much so that there are strong and respectable tendencies in various sciences to deny the existence of genuine transformations. From a scientific perspective, transformations tend to be viewed much like myths, as halfway houses between various prisons of ignorance and various safe havens of liberation secured through knowledge. They are construed as mere transitions, extremely subtle, but quantifiable modifications in and of something that are not yet fully, but nonetheless will eventually be understood thoroughly. Knowledge, it is believed, will catch up with transformations and then translate them one by one into those complex but thoroughly comprehensible transitions that they actually are. Let us note that transformations are typically ascribed only to human beings. We are wary of attributing them to other regions of reality. This tells us that arguments over transformations find their primary, if not exclusive, battleground on the field of the human. To speak of transformation is almost always to engage in contention over our human nature. We tend to think of transitions as quite different from transformations. Typically, we construe them as transitions as gradual and largely continuous in nature. Aristotle is not a bad model for understanding that. But if Aristotle helps us greatly, and I'm skipping over some parts of this presentation, in understanding transitions, it is probably the early Hegel who provides some initial grounding with respect to a sustained entry and access to the notion of transformation. On Hegel's account, transformations in human history are driven by failures of integration, what are construed as somewhat flexible, yet also settled features of an historical moment or human situation coexist and interrelate, but do not harmonize with each other. More often than not, these same features are in a state of overt or hidden conflict with each other. Such conflicts, Hegel tells us, are best revealed and paradoxically most productive in outcome if human living in a particular era is earnest, serious, and even passionate. This is to say, wholehearted with respect to the prevailing values and understanding of that era or human situation. To be noted especially is that what drives these potentially transformational situations as well is an underlying goal embedded within them. That goal or meta-purpose provides the most efficacious component of their dynamism and may almost always be misconstrued or miscomprehended, not only initially, but for a long time thereafter. I won't go further into this other than to say I very deliberately avoided usual Hegelian jargon and wish to put this on a setting that makes it more accessible and more contemporary to our times. On a scholarly front, I think this can be justified as not doing injustice to Hegel either. Now, I mentioned goals of probably a latent sort that drive the Hegelian dynamic. What if no goal can be found in a current historical circumstance. What happens then to the conflict model I have so very briefly sketched? Note that Hegel himself had anticipated such a situation as all but inevitable. If, as Hegel believed, history in his particular sense of it had or would reach its consummation in his time, then options available in a post-Hegelian future would be somewhat bleak or meager. Let me mention just a few. One option would be the education and reformation of supposedly less advanced peoples, an essentially Enlightenment-inspired project. Or two, more generally, numerous ameliorative or reformist projects in the service of repairing societally or personally structural elements in a condition of deterioration. And a third option would be nihilism, construed as the collapse of a certain state of condition of things or of particular human beings. The above is what I believe has happened with the conflict model in our time. That is to say that many of the salient features of its aftermath, the aftermath of the relevance of the conflict model, largely sort out into the three alternatives I've just mentioned. There is another temperament, however, and a different orientation, and I shall call it the deficit or void model or orientation. It stands in some opposition to the conflict account. As with most overarching stances, the void orientation has numerous variants, themselves sometimes in significant contention with each other. There are at least two prominent, historically grounded examples we can draw from within continental philosophy. In Nietzsche, the proclamation of God's death is meant to open and make accessible an occluded, largely hollow and empty space that will then provide opportunities for creative value engenderings. By way of contrast, in Heidegger, the relevant obsession with absence, the nothing, and clearings is meant to make way and make a way for a new dispensation, one more luminous and transcendent that is exclusively and discernibly human. Of course, our current circumstances are ones in which many conflicts still do abound. Human history is always replete with them. I don't wish to deny this. With due recognition and acknowledgement of the 20th century existential thinkers, however, not the least of them Karl Jaspers, these conflicts might nonetheless be characterized as primarily political and economic in nature. A large claim that I must skip beyond now in the hopes of reaching the further points in my paper. What if we were to revisit Kant and pick up the receptivity strain in his thinking? A few already significant cues emerge from this sort of reflection. One of the pure forms of sensibility, that is, receptivity, is space. Kant tells us that though we can think of space without objects, we cannot think of objects without space. Kant does have, of course, a sense-bound epistemology. That which we are equipped to encounter and construe is mediated through our senses. What happens, however, if we open ourselves to the possibility that our receptivity, in addition, is capable of encountering meaning? To be sure, most, if not all, of this realm of meaning may be attached to the sensible realm, but it would nonetheless not thereby be reducible to it. Such a reduction would require a significant number of further arguments. Consider now the possibility that a space of meaning may be part and parcel of the structural constitution of our human life as human beings in the world. Consider further the historical possibility that an era might emerge in which no meaning-laden objects or situations are found, nor arrive into this space of meaning. Kant tells us that concepts without percepts are empty, On the view I am forwarding, would it not make sense to say that non-sensibly oriented space, one bereft of meaningful items, would not only be empty, but would be potentially devastating in its bleakness? Were this the case, we might find the notion of voids not only imaginable, but possibly therapeutically and philosophically compelling. We might also become more inclined to believe the notion of conflict, rational or other in nature, is not sufficient with respect to grasping the dynamics of potentially transformative human situations and predicaments. From here, I go on to reflect on what the dynamic is in terms of Nietzsche, where I, of course, make the point that the theological claim about God's death is far less significant in many ways than the underlying driving notion that the sources of significant experience have been diminishing in number, location, and intensity. We might be able to endure the absence of meaning-laden objects or circumstances in our space. We could muse that it might be feasible in a transitional way, but probably over a vastly longer period of time, it will not be a viable condition for the human spirit. What is likely to happen if we do not take the underlying issues of void or emptiness seriously is that in an age where the blandishments of technology are overwhelming, emptiness of an underlying spiritual space may become a devastating phenomenon. We should remember that Jaspers and Heidegger, both relatively early in their careers, believed that technology could become the most significant threat to the human spirit that we had yet historically experienced. Now, we know that Nietzsche had his ways about this, Heidegger had his, and I think they're both significant and important to consider further. But let me bring some closure to these reflections by means of a few historically oriented reminders. First, it is hard not to appreciate a dimension of givenness within our human cognitive situation. Though we can talk about deficits and voids, we live in and surrounded by a world of contents, objects, and situations. Second, it is equally difficult to reduce the givenness of meaning to that of simply sensible content. Third, unless we go the route of a modalology, givenness is not explicable except through an appropriate receptivity. Fourth, what in epistemological tropes we are inclined to label object or content may well have an historical life of its own. That is, the world of meaning need not be construed as altogether subjective or reducible to subjective tropes. And that the notion of meaning may have a measure of independence of particular aspirations, needs, and agendas. Among other things, this would be to reflect on notions such as zeitgeist. And if this is true, we might well sometimes be in situations where meaning, as more broadly understood, is not enduringly accessible, but only feebly or in limited ways. And were this so, we might make a lot more sense of maneuvers we might undertake, cognitive strategies we might employ to re-engender the notion of presence. Let me end by quoting from Jaspers. We can do nothing to plan the future realities of faith. We can only be ready to receive it and live in such a manner that this readiness increases. We cannot make our own transformation the goal of our wills. This would be the kind of contra Nietzsche remark in the quote from Jaspers. The transformation rather must be bestowed upon us if we live in such a fashion that we can experience this gift. With this, it seems proper to keep silent about the faith of the future. I'll say just a few things in the end here. I feel like some intellectual traffic cop or highway patrolman should soon be upon me for intellectual speeding, probably even reckless driving. But I did want to give a certain kind of overview, and it meant that I needed to slight certain things and jump over others. Core notion. How do we understand the notion of transformation and what can be transformative? Secondly, are there ways escaping the kind of subjectivism that our Western tradition, at least since Descartes, has been caught up in? Are there ways in which there are communicable interpersonal means by which transformation can be engendered, tracked, guided? Reflection on it can be contextualized in a way that's thoughtful, intellectual, and with clinical dimensions. And perhaps a last point, there is a rich content in philosophy that tends toward abstraction, and there is an equally rich content in therapeutic settings that is by the nature of the responsibility of therapeutic sessions, circumstances caught up in very thick, very concrete, and often, of course, therefore, very messy material. How do these traditions come together in our time, as opposed to the very thoughtful and needed reflection on how they could have been put together in previous times? So that's about it for this evening.
Thank you.
Thanks for the interesting paper on transformation. I really appreciated it. So I found interesting your distinction between transformation and transition, and how it's much easier to accept a notion of transition within the sciences instead of, say, transformation. But one question I have is regarding the absence that you kept raising up, and sort of the Nietzsche's death of God and so on. And one sort of pressing, and this is sort of tangential to the whole paper, but maybe just add your thoughts. One question I have is, so we have in a number of thinkers that, like, so for instance, Sartre, that like emphasizes absence as having to do with comportment. So who are we? Well, we are really nothing, right? But this nothing is sort of a motivating nothing. And so I was thinking, what do we make of people? So we see that, for instance, our society might be grounded or influenced on sort of the nothingness that Nietzsche proclaims about the death of God. So it's like brought together through this unity, which is a unity grounded around absence. And I was wondering what you think of certain people, returning maybe to Daniel Dennett, who talk about, say, qualia, and say quining qualia, and they want to get rid of it. And they say, well, actually, it doesn't exist. It's nothing. But in saying this, what do you think about this nothing of, say, qualia being something that is motivating, or something that is maybe even transformative or something like that?
I'm sorry I can't speak to the Dennett issues, but I'll say in response to something else you said that I think dealing with this notion of nothing that I'd prefer to label absence is best done in a more specific way to generate an understanding of it out of a sense of loss and a sense of something being missing, however inchoate. And therefore it gets caught up in a need to reflect on notions like grief and denial. I'm especially concerned, maybe it's the philosophical background in European thinking, with ways in which loss can be understood as not just personal or generated out of individual personal circumstance, but there can be the experience of cultural loss and ways in which cultural loss, even not fully cognizant to the person who is experiencing that cultural loss, can also have a great significance in human existence.
I would like to raise a question. Oh, by the way, I very much enjoyed the presentation. I'd like to raise one thing you said something about openness being the condition for spontaneity. So I wanted to ask you about that. And then in the very last part of your talk, you mention Jasper's contra Nietzsche in the sense that we cannot will our own transformations. They have to somehow be received almost like in a state of grace.
Yeah.
So I wonder if you could tie those two together. And then just as a little kind of coda to that, I'm curious about Jung, because Jung uses the term symbols of transformation. So, okay, I'm not sure that those three things hang together, but thank you.
Well, I think they're excellent issues to bring up, and even as I said, that spontaneity must be quite dependent on receptivity, a little warning flag went up in my mind that I thought that that remark would receive some attention in the aftermath here. So you've kind of confirmed the prediction I had. Let me start with that. Look at Kant for a moment. Two stems of knowledge, and we won't call them for the moment reason and sensibility. We'll call them spontaneity and receptivity. And then we can consider in Kant the notion that for spontaneity to work, something must be given to spontaneity, and it's given through receptivity. I'd be willing to consider, for those who have a especially philosophical interest, Kant's notion that perhaps there's some common but unknown root from which both spontaneity and receptivity arise. Whether that would turn out to be true, and I think it's badly labeled by Kant as Einbildungskraft, but whether that would turn out to be true, there's, I think, a strong sense that whatever else we're receptive to, we are also, and sometimes very unfortunately, receptive to circumstances in which there's a kind of absence of significance to what we might be doing or what might be done around us. Question about will relevant to Nietzsche. I gather that in a number of Jasper's moments, and I read him as eclectic, he wants to take Nietzsche to task for forcing certain things, and that in various kinds of circumstances there has to be, if not a patience, at least a kind of period of waiting or maybe a reorienting that makes an action more relevant and helpful than it would be if the reorienting hadn't occurred. Regarding Jung, I have some difficulty reading him, though I've read a bit of him. The boilerplate answer is the following. Freud is very concerned about sexual matters. Alfred Adler about power matters, and Jung about matters of meaning. Don't fully know quite what to say about that. I think each figure, as far as I know about them, is a bit complex. But I think Jung may be the most humane of the three, most willing to get caught up in issues of meaning. But I guess we can't forget that he was a bit of an autodidact, and his writing probably doesn't have the focus and discipline of other writers, notably Freud or people more in the Freudian tradition.
All right, so I'll ask first, my philosophical side often pushes me to my journalistic side and sort of commonsensical formulations from which I then try to climb back to the philosophy I know. So let me try this articulation. I'm kind of fascinated by what might be a triangulation among transformation, transition, right? And the void or nothingness, right? So it seems to me that I'm reminded of a book I wrote about in my own book called The Nothing That Is, which is a book about zero, the number zero. And in my mind, with a transition or a transformation, it has to be from something to something, rather than something to nothing. Something to nothing is extinction. It's not transformation or transition, whatever the subtleties of meaning might be between those two. And forgive me for thinking perhaps sensationalistically, but as you were talking, I couldn't help thinking about the German wings crash and the endless analysis in the last week or two in the media of the personality of the pilot. Why did he do this? What did he think he was doing? What did he think he was taking himself to and all the passengers? And it seems to me that there's been probably more discussion of mental illness in the last week in the media than we've seen in a long time, that there might be something to the idea of this, that if you could convince people that in a transition or a transformation, they're always going from something to something rather than something to nothing, that might be a step toward healthy evaluation of what the something is that you're moving toward, right? So, I see this very nice triangulation of concepts in your paper as very relevant to, things that the world is talking about, right now. And, that almost every void, this is part of what I took from that book, The Nothing That Is, every void is actually a something. It's not a nothing. So I just wonder, when you try to connect what you're writing about to an issue like a personality of someone who takes himself, in the opinion of some people and others, from something to nothing, whether that's really an accurate description.
First, about the particular situation you mentioned, I wouldn't know what to say about it, and I think it'd be a long time before people are able to say a lot about this particular situation with the pilot. But when you said from something to something, it brought this to mind. Now, again, sometimes you say things in quick ways that require a lot more expansion than you can give them in a particular setting. Some have said that so much of Greek metaphysics can be reduced to the notion that something is better than nothing. Consider the possibility that we see, it's written about, for instance, in Hegel's Freedom and Terror section of the Phenomenology of Spirit. What's said there, among other things, is that in certain circumstances, nothing might be better than something. And I gather this means in certain transformational circumstances that there needs to be some kind of an emptying out or an opening up, or Heidegger's rather strained understanding of what Gelassenheit is, a kind of letting go. And we talk, for instance, of John Ghetto in the psychoanalytic tradition about holding environments, or with Heinz Kohut, a kind of empathic relation to a patient on the basis of which the patient actually is able to let go, to open a space for him or herself. And it's probably a reach to call this an encounter with nothingness. I actually myself personally don't like the nothing reference, but it is sometimes an opening for a kind of absence or grief and a grieving. And a kind of underlying question that probably obsesses me is, are there cultural circumstances in particular historical moments such as ours that, whether they're consciously absorbed or not, are often part of the full circumstance of presenting patients and people living in what is a technologically driven, in some ways impoverished, dürftige Zeit?
Yeah, thank you, Steve, for your paper. I liked it a lot, and as far as I can understand, your talk was somehow, I would, if I had to sum it up, how can we come into terms with history?
I like that.
Our history.
Yes.
How can we somehow still expect something which is not historical? And is it possible to expect it? And what could be some of the process? And if I get your terms transition and transformation right, transition for me would be something just happening in history without any higher meaning. Just something going on. And transformation would be something Jaspers might call it with the origin and the goal. Something like which has a philosophy of history. And the way you are making your points, you were somehow circumscribing it, very cautious. And I think, Aaron was mentioning the term craze, a religious term. And from my understanding, when we talk about things, we like things to come. But whether they come or not, they're somehow depending on craze. And therefore I like the way you are talking, just circumscribing it, not being too sure whether it comes or not.
Right.
And when you were talking about Heidegger, since Heidegger himself, there's this famous term of his Kehre. And as far as I understand Heidegger, and I like him in that way quite much, the early Heidegger is the one who has a very clear sensitivity for what history means. And history in the term of not a transition, but a transformation towards nothingness. And this is somehow a way of putting history into something absolute, where man is confronted with himself just as a subjectivity without any higher goal. And maybe this person in this German wing airplane could have been someone who was encountering his nothingness, somehow trying to make it something absolute. And therefore we could quote Hegel again as the form of absolute freedom, which is an absolute way of destructing himself and other people. An absolute form of desperation, whatever the reason for this desperation could be. And then the later Heidegger, the Heidegger of the Science Denken, who's asking whether the people are science forgetting the sign, is somehow turning in a person who's expecting something too. And the later Heidegger with this term of the Frömmigkeit des Denkens, piety of thinking. And for my estimation, you had a certain piety of thinking today. Thanks.
Well, my reactions to your remarks are yes, 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 and yes, but in the midst of that, a sort of hesitation that I have myself. You have got it just right about me circumscribing certain things and being hesitant about talking about them. Because sometimes I think it's so important that questions get cultivated and nurtured in order for any of us, including me who wants to pursue them in a really constructive way. But I don't mean by that at all to suggest that I've got something here in my pocket, and if I think the time's right, I'm going to pull it out. Suppose as I think about it on this particular evening, I do take seriously the notion that one thing philosophy needs to do is to hope not just to be the child of its time, but somehow comprehend its time, our time, in thought. And with respect to a conversation involving psychoanalytic thinking and philosophy, it seems to me part of our time is a time when much that could be counted on in the past is missing. It could be generational, but part of what's taking its place seems to be very quick, efficient, technological kind of ways of doing things. And that is an awkward transition that involves, I think, for many people, certain forms of agony or sense of even possibly despair, that you can't fully explain by reference to family matters and psychosocial kind of phenomena. Is that at all helpful? I mean, we're always on a fast track in these meetings. I feel badly that my presentation wasn't smoother. I was trying to pack what was hopefully a full meal into a snack between A and B.
Yes, and whetted the appetite. I wanted to ask about Nietzsche, and that every creative act involves a destruction, and whether the transformation that you're speaking about with regard to Hegel requires destruction, whether there's a destructive moment, whether that's encountering, I think he cites Heidegger, das nicht in der Nix, das nicht in der Nix, the nothing that nothings, whether that is a productive force in self-transformation.
Well, two things. The Hegelian point would be that negative destructive elements may well be prospectively encountered. In retrospect, were Hegel's story correct, accurate, and adequate, one would reflect back and see that what seemed to be have gone beyond or even destroyed in the process of going beyond it is recuperated and caught up in the present, in a full present. Remember Hegel's power of the negative, power of the negative, power of the negative, on and on and on in his early writings. Now about Nietzsche, here's probably my take on this. And for anyone on YouTube or wherever that won't quite get this because it's possibly jargon for many people, one of the themes Nietzsche has is the Dionysian element, which I'll now very loosely call our energies, have to be allowed to break through Apollonian form insofar as the elements of Apollo altogether discipline and constrain Dionysian energy. That's a formula for a kind of stagnation. It amounts to sort of becoming one's own disciple. So I think in this respect, Nietzsche, and he kind of loves talking this way, is prepared to embrace dangerous and potentially destructive moments in the name of releasing certain Dionysian energies. I think this is itself a very dangerous doctrine, and it's maybe, forgive me for saying this, easier to applaud when you're much, much younger than when you get a little bit older and your hair begins to turn color.
Thank you. A stimulating discussion on that paper. Thanks to everybody. We're going to move on now to Daniel Adsett's presentation. Daniel is a doctoral student at Marquette University, and he'll be talking to us on meaning and diagnosis. Are mental illnesses genuinely mental?
So this paper, which I wrote, is quite speculative on the one hand. On the other hand, it's trying to bring together, in a certain sense, Jaspers and Husserl without trying to trace any kind of historical lineage or influence. So, I mean, while I have to acknowledge the importance of, say, Michael Schwartz, who couldn't make it, his papers, and as well as Chris Walker's analysis of Husserl and Jaspers, I'm not going to be trying to make a historical claim here. Rather, what I want to try to say here, and this is again speculative, and I welcome kind of questions that will challenge this and maybe further on my paper here, but I want to ask if mental illnesses are illnesses of the mind or if they're not. So I'm glad the topic of technology came up earlier because, again, I'm going to look at technology and the increasing influence of sort of the technologization of medicine, but I'm also going to look at Husserl and Jaspers and their accounts of meaning. So Husserl's meaning conferring acts, and then Jaspers' meaningful connections. So with that, I'll start the paper. So meaning and diagnosis, are mental illnesses genuinely mental? In this paper, I claim that the attempt to think what are traditionally called mental illnesses or madness entirely in terms of neuro or biochemical arrangements requires a Husserlian division between apodictic or absolutely certain structures of experience and contingent embodiment or manifestations of these structures. Further, I claim that the foreseeable rise in technological approaches to the diagnoses of mental illnesses does not challenge the existential and phenomenological account of meaning. So in other words, the phenomenologists and existentialists remain relevant. So researchers at King's College London have recently demonstrated that fMRI scans can be profitably used to distinguish subjects with bipolar disorder from controls with a success rate of around 70%. On their account, I quote, "Our results demonstrate that GPC-based neuroanatomical pattern recognition techniques may prove clinically useful in improving the timely diagnosis of bipolar disorder, which currently relies entirely on clinical symptoms, so evaluation of behavior and speech and things like that." End quote. Conceivably, then, with the ongoing development of technology and a better understanding of the neuronal patterns associated with bipolar disorder, a time might arise, this is speculative, when fMRI or similar scans will function as diagnostic machines for mental disturbances, just as, for example, an X-ray today can highlight the location of a fracture, a brain scan might someday unequivocally show a patient to have schizophrenia, a personality disorder, or any other number of mental disturbances. Through these methods, then, madness can be relocated from the realm of personality and character, something invisible and largely inferred from behavior, to the realm of the physical, something directly observable and manipulatable. The role of the psychiatrist as someone capable of making behaviorally grounded diagnoses is potentially, in the extreme case, at risk if routine scanning becomes mandatory. So if we scan all, say, citizens and then separate those with patterns that are associated with certain mental illnesses from those who don't have them. So in what follows, I will hold that brain scans taken in isolation, along with other purely neurobiochemical data, are only significant insofar as we relate them to, one, this is implicitly, not explicitly, one, the Jaspersian meaningful connections a doctor finds, and two, the Husserlian meaning-conferring acts of a patient. So one being the one looking on to the patient, the other one being the patient's own meaning-conferring acts. So further, because the Husserlian apodictic or necessary structures of experience, such as, these are just a number of them, intentionality, the adumbrations of perceptions, and the always contingent character of the world, and so on, operate in cases of madness and mental illness, I suggest that brain scans are not identifying mental disturbances. So they're not identifying something about the mind, but rather, like behavioral expressions, disturbances in the way the mind is manifested or embodied. So Jaspersian meaningful connections. In his 1959 article, The Physician in the Technological Age, Karl Jaspers claims that the physician should be a more than technician. She should have an intimate knowledge and awareness of her patient through, I quote, the observation of the body, the excitations, the behavior, and the significance of the environment, end quote. The collective and impersonal physician has no time or interest in providing this kind of attention. Inner experiences for her are subordinate to somatic processes. The first kind of physician is distinct from the second insofar as she endorses Verstande psychology, or a psychology of meaningful connections, whereby she will try to understand, as far as possible, the patient from the patient's own situation and perspective. In doing this, the Verstande doctor will necessarily try to unravel various meaningful connections through open-ended conversation. Much earlier, in 1912, Jaspers cautions us that understanding psychology as an empathic approach remains distinct from phenomenology as a mere articulation of inner experiences without a corresponding attempt to meaningfully or causally understand these same experiences. So in other words, he separates empathic understanding on the one hand from phenomenology. He says that phenomenology, as he knows it from Husserl and logical investigations, is static, and meaningful connections are genetic, or they trace how certain experiences arise out of earlier experiences and associations. So empathic understanding names the way a physician can use the results gathered from phenomenological research to comport herself towards the experiences of her patient. As someone who is, first of all, trying to understand what the patient is experiencing from the patient's own perspective and not strictly through some applied schema. So that's empathic understanding. Whereas phenomenological description, on Jasper's account, is largely static, meaningful connections arise out of genetic relations that are unique to a patient's experience. Phenomenological observation, in other words, provides the background against which physicians can establish meaningful connections, such that verbal and expressive communication between physician and patient is central to both phenomenological observation and the discovery of meaningful connections. In the same 1912 article, Jaspers makes a further distinction between two kinds of meaning. While communicating with her patient, the psychiatrist must acknowledge that the rational meaning of an utterance is distinct from its intentional meaning, whereas the rational meaning of a statement can be analyzed without any reference to psychological processes. The intentional or inner meaning can only be arrived at through empathy. The former names a semantic approach, so largely to the study of propositions, whether or not a proposition is meaningful or not, regardless of what the utterer of the proposition cares about or intends, while the latter, or the intentional meaning, is largely foundational, so where the meaning arises. So a statement that is ill-formed or even nonsensible, semantically, so in its propositional form, if we just write out a statement, it might have bad grammar, or it might have words that aren't in a dictionary, might harbor deep intentional meaning. So even if the statement semantically is totally bizarre, it might be intended with a certain meaning intention. So I quote, "Where the speech apparatus is normal, speech, apart from its content, is psychic expression, as for instance, shrieking, shouting, whispering, and every possible nuance of tone, as we can observe in any disturbed ward. Or it may be in the form of monotonous, expressionless speech, or speech heightened in tone and lively. It may show itself in the rhythm, in nonsensical emphasis, in normal syntax, or in syntax that cuts across sense, or in the general manner, such as the imitation of infantile speech," end quote. So here's Jaspers listing off different forms of unusual speech patterns. So in cases where the semantic meaning is nonsensical, as well as in all cases where semantic meaning still remains intact, Jaspers urges physicians to try to gather the intentional meaning, whereas, I quote, "rational understanding always only enables us to say that a certain rational complex, something which can be understood without any psychology whatever, was the content of the mind. Empathic understanding, on the other hand, leads us into the psychic connections themselves," end quote. It is through the intentional, as well as the semantic meanings expressed in audible and physical communication, that the physician comes to learn about the patient's inner experiences, that the patient is suffering, what kind of suffering, and possible clues about the genesis and development of the suffering. Turning now to Husserlian meaning-conferring acts. Though separate, a static phenomenology of inner experiences can lead physicians to grasp genetic meanings and identify meaningful connections. And so, while Jaspers is right to argue that, on the side of the physician, the early Husserlian phenomenologist is largely not interested in trying to understand or empathize with the experiences of her patient, again, this changes later on in Husserl's writings, Husserl is, in his logical investigations, very much interested in the production of meaning, and more specifically, on the side of the patient, how so-called foundational or intentional meaning becomes semantic, rational, or propositional. In his sixth investigation, Husserl famously takes intentionality to be a defining feature of thought, the central aspect that distinguishes it from non-thought. In addition, however, to intentionality, he also describes the correlation it obtains between intentional thought and object thought. Within any intentional act, there lies a distinction between content and object. The content is divided into quality and matter, whereby the matter carries the meaning, and the object, whereby the matter carries the meaning, while the object side of the intention can either be empty or fulfilled, unrealized or realized. Any intention, moreover, is always directed toward a single object that, if intuited, can fulfill the intention. If, for example, I utter cat without imagining or perceiving a cat, the object of my intention is empty, but there is still an object to my intention. If, however, I see or imagine a cat, the object of my intention is realized while the intention itself is fulfilled. Regardless of whether I see or imagine a cat, my intention has meaning and is directed toward an object, fulfilled or not. That is, the original meaningfulness of an intentional act is on the side of the intention as opposed to the intuition and object, or the fulfilled object. Thus, meaning originates not in any external object, such as the cat that is perceived or the cat that is imagined, such as a brain scan, or even the brain scan, an intuition, imagined or perceived, but in the original and agential intention to produce the meaning, the patient's own expressions and utterances. And I quote, "An expression only refers to an object correlate because it means something. It can be rightly said to signify or name the object through its meaning," end quote. Soon after, Husserl states that, quote, "relation to an actually given objective correlate, an intuition which fulfills the meaning intention, is not essential to an expression," end quote. "The meaning of an utterance or an expression is not dependent on the statement's semantic meaning. A patient might mean something even if her clanging or disordered speech," again, the type of speech that Jasper described earlier, "renders the semantic meanings of her utterances incoherent. The psychiatrist, then, who is interested in meaningful connections must therefore phenomenologically approach the inner experiences in order to, as far as possible, discern a patient's intentional or inner meaning. When the psychiatrist fails to understand the patient's expressions and or speech, following Jasper's, the patient's meanings are ununderstandable. But insofar as we adopt a Husserlian account of meaning-conferring acts, even the ununderstandable patient means something through her expressions and locutions." Now we're turning to the relationship between eidetic and empirical phenomenology. The kind of phenomenology Jaspers discusses is largely empirical. It is interested in the experiences of patients and their formal structure. Husserl, by contrast, from his logical investigations onward, tries to develop an eidetic phenomenology, or a phenomenology that searches for the necessary or apodictic structures of experience. In the Prolegomena to Pure Logic, in the first part of the first volume of Logical Investigations, Husserl criticizes psychologism for trying to trace logical laws back to psychological processes. Among his many criticisms, he holds that psychologism cannot account for abnormal thought. I quote, "What we have before us as a natural law of contradiction is, in fact, a rough empirical generalization, which suffers from a quite unspecifiable degree of indefiniteness. How abnormal minds behave is something on which the everyday experience here adduced has nothing to tell us," end quote. So in other words, what Husserl keeps repeating throughout this Prolegomena is that the various psychologists, specifically, say, Sigvart and, Mill, there's a whole group of them, but what they want to do is they trace logical laws, such as the law of excluded middle, the law of contradiction, and so on, even syllogisms, back to brain processes. And in some cases, they trace them back to individuals and their brain processes, or the way they think, or they trace them back to the way the human species as a whole thinks. But the problem, Husserl notes in this, is that there are a number of problems. One is that they're deriving a norm, so the way we should think, that is the laws of logic, so we should think non-contradictorily in syllogisms perhaps, and also with law of excluded middle and whatnot. They derive the normative laws of logic from the way things are, so empirical, or the real ways we act. He says that one is a fallacy. Secondly, they only turn to people who have normal thought processes. So in the case of non-contradiction, people like Sigvart only privilege people who are so-called normal, and they don't take into account the abnormal strains of thought. So what Husserl is trying to do in the Prolegomena is establish that laws of logic cannot arise out of, or they're not reducible to psychological processes, in part because they are in a sense normative, and you can't get a normative claim from an empirical fact. And secondly, because he wants to account for how abnormal thought is possible, which I think is highly significant when we're looking at psychopathology. So again, returning here, Husserl is therefore after the apodictic structures of thought that are common to both the sane and the mad, the intentional character of thought, the adumbrations of perceptions, and the always elusive character of the world are all examples of structures that Husserl demonstrates throughout his career adequately present themselves to the eidetic phenomenologist, that is, the phenomenologist who practices her philosophy as a quest for unshakable structures. This is the kind of rigorous science that Husserl was after that, Jaspers found problematic, but I think we can talk about that after. So if we identify the mind, then, with these apodictic structures that Husserl has tried to seek out, and again, among these apodictic structures, or structures that are common to normal and, say, pathological thought, are intentionality, adumbrations of perception. So the fact that whenever you perceive something, you never perceive the whole object. It's always only part, and it can always be continually fulfilled. And then the world can always be other than what you perceive it to be, so you can comport yourself toward the world, but it can always be different. That's another apodictic structure. And so Husserl isolates a number of these. If you look in his lectures on first philosophy, he again goes into this kind of eidetic phenomenology. So if we identify the mind further with these apodictic structures, then mental illnesses are no longer failures of the mind, so they're not failures of intentionality. The person with schizophrenia still thinks about things and still has adumbrations of perceptions, and still the world is always possible to be other for that person. But rather, they're failures that are made possible because of the mind. So in order for these mental or psychotic cases and neurotic cases to be possible, there must be these common kind of structures that Husserl argues eidetic phenomenology isolates. One of them, I think most significant, or more significantly, are these kind of meaning-conferring acts. So it's not necessarily the content that we're after, but the fact that even people with psychotic difficulties, still there is meaning there in what they say, even if the semantic proposition, the semantic structure of the propositions is highly difficult to figure out. So psychosis, sociopathy, and neurosis all require the intentionality of thought, so that thought be about things, adumbrations of perceptions, that is, you can never perceive an object in its entirety at once, and the retreat of the world, so the fact that the world can always be other than what you currently perceive it to be, in order to be possible. Insofar as we accept these apodictic structures as characterizing an admittedly thin account of the mind, it is questionable as to whether mental illnesses are failures of the mind or failures of how the mind is embodied. So in other words, as we were talking about earlier, thought insertion. So the form of psychosis where we have thought insertion, that becomes an abnormal, ununderstandable process or form. But the fact that the thought insertion or thought in the thought insertion has meaning, or that it's intentional, that remains the same throughout psychosis and normal thought. So returning now to our initial problem, that of whether technology might render clinical and/or phenomenological psychology outdated, we can argue by referring to both the Husserl and Jaspers that whether or not a patient is sick, insofar as she can think, she means very different things. So we're not, again, talking here about being asleep or being unconscious, or as we had talked about earlier, cases of neurosurgery where people may or may not be conscious anymore. We're talking here about largely, say, what are classified as mental illnesses. So no amount of technology will be able to interpret and understand brain scans further without referring to the meaningful expressions. So if we have a brain scan, just like we have an X-ray, without any meaning, or without the patient sort of showing that they are discomfortable or maybe not conforming to society, the brain scan as such, without, on the one hand, the psychiatrist trying to find meaningful connections or the meaning-conferring acts being problematic, it doesn't mean anything. It's not there. It's just this blank kind of graph. Here we go. So no amount of technology will be able to interpret and understand brain scans without referring to meaningful expressions, both the Aspersian meaningful connections that a psychiatrist must make and the Husserlian meaning-conferring acts that render a patient's speech meaningful. Finally, in response to the question asked in the title of the paper, whether or not meaningful illness or mental illnesses are genuinely mental, I believe that if we link the mental, not with technically accessible neuronal patterns, but with their Husserlian apodictic structures that make experience and meaning possible, the structures eidetic phenomenology tries to discover, what we commonly call mental illnesses are not failures of the structures of experience, failures of intentionality, adumbrations of perceptions, and so on, but failures in the register of empirical phenomenology, or how these structures relate to embodied experience. So in other words, what Jaspers is doing in his psychopathology is not, on Husserl's account, eidetic phenomenology. So it's not after the apodictic structures of experience. Rather, it's after what characterizes various groups of experiencers. So pathological states, what's common to the schizophrenic processes, or say bipolar processes, or so on and so on. Those are empirical, that's empirical phenomenology for Husserl, which is, he claims, highly important, but it's not eidetic phenomenology, which is after the apodictic structures. So in Ideas 3, for instance, Husserl lays out really clearly and nicely the difference between eidetic and empirical phenomenology, where eidetic phenomenology is largely the ground of all kind of the sciences, in that empirical phenomenology is sort of a modification of eidetic phenomenology, which studies contingent structures of experience and what it's like to experience things, whereas objective psychology is, again, the most popular kind of psychology, is the psychology they do in a lot of schools, which is looking at objective features of experiences and sort of behavior, external manifestations. So we have these sort of three layers in psychology, which I think are important to look at. So Jaspers is in the empirical phenomenology, Husserl's after eidetic phenomenology, as well as empirical, and then our normal psychology that we often practice today is often objective psychology. So I just want to thank you for listening and open it up to questions.
I thought this is a very good paper, and now I'll overstate a bit and think this very good paper was about aspects of a project, not your project, but the projects of the people you're reflecting on, projects that are in a certain way misguided. Now, let me say something to that. This is not about you and what you've said, but about the people you're writing about. I made distinctions of a simple sort between conflict and deficit, transformation and transition. Now I'd like to make another, probably all too simple distinction between what we'll call holism and atomism, calling it atomism a little bit unfairly. I think that part of the project that we all need to consider is how to talk more directly to life situations or ways in which people are in the world. And the kinds of things can be done in neuroscience through neuropathology and other medical dimensions of our study are very important, but unless we see them within the framework of life situations, I don't think we'll get nearly as far as we're going to need and already need to go. But I think this is very important stuff you're writing about. I'd like to see it in a slightly larger framework.
Partly what you're talking about is the issue that was raised before of correlations between behavior and neurological findings. What would stop society and the medical profession and the psychiatric profession from this sort of inductive reasoning, that we have found a regular correlation between certain neurological results and certain behaviors in the past? People who flash, brain scans flash this way, go off and kill people. So then we have somebody whose brain flashes this way but hasn't killed anybody yet. Wouldn't it be possible for society to move toward that sort of criteriological decision that, actually the technological advance here is in predictability? Of course, you have the old justification of induction, problem. Here comes the black swan after all the white swans. Maybe this person will never kill someone. And if that turned out to be the case, of course, it weakens, the argument for switching the paradigm, of mental illness to the neurological result. But I could certainly see as a practical matter that happening in society if the inductive results took a certain form, right? 80%, 90%. So can you relate, what you think at the moment in regard to this material, in regard to that societal possibility?
Yeah, thanks. That's a really good question. And in fact, so earlier on in my paper, I said something about routine scanning becomes possible. And I mean, we think, okay, well, that's improbable. But I actually have here as a footnote an article from Huffington Post from January 28, 2013, which says, "Screening children for mental illnesses, experts call for early testing." And if I remember correctly, in this article, they're talking about, I think in the UK, thinking of screening all children in schools for mental illnesses. And so in a sense, he's like, this is wonderful, because then we'll be able to catch depression early or catch these problems early so we can medicate them, and then we can prevent them from committing suicide or getting in drugs and all this other stuff, right? So we think it's this wonderful new advancement. But I think with a lot of advancements, we have this kind of two-way problem. So, I mean, for instance, this is kind of a digression, but I think it'll get to the point. with, you know, America's war on terrorism, for instance, we have, we think, oh no, we got to protect ourselves from terrorists. But in order to do that, we have to monitor society more closely. We think, okay, this is great. We're going to monitor society. We're going to check everyone's emails and things like that. And so in this effort to become safer, we also become much more, say, suspicious and anxious. So in a sense, it almost increases our anxiety if we try to prevent ourselves from having this anxiety in a certain sense. So it's like, oh no, is my children taking the medication today because she may grow up to be depressed because she has a certain brain structure. So I think you're exactly right. There's a danger in this sort of technicalization and over surveillance of us that leads to a certain loss of freedom and a certain expectations too. And I know with some projects, getting your, say, genes mapped with like 23andMe, I think it is, I think some of them, they're not allowed to tell you what kind of medical conditions you have or not, because there's certain ones that are like inevitable. I can't remember entirely what it is, but there's certain conditions where it's like you will have them. But yeah, I think I mean, especially with the case of mental illness, there's so much more work to do with these processes that it's hard to, and it's tempting, but it's hard to say like whether a certain brain structure will lead predictably or with like say 70% chance to a certain behavior. And I don't know. I mean, I'm kind of of the mind that we should just, I don't know, not over surveil, you know, but I don't know.
Okay,
I really,
can I follow
yeah.
up with one quick thing and then okay. You know, I was thinking about it a little bit in comparison again with another recent, well-known sort of media event when Angelina Jolie announced that, again, because of testing and because of results in her family and all of that, she was going to have further surgery to avoid ovarian cancer and so on. And she was widely praised by doctors around the world for the op-ed she wrote in the New York Times because, okay, it's a 75% chance that she would get that cancer, 85% chance, right? Now, and that seems quite distinguishable from, at least at this point, what we think would happen when we see a certain sort of flashing or we see certain things genetically and that person is going to be a serial killer or that person is going to be a sexual molester or so on. And so I was wondering, you know, in thinking as you are about a sort of connection between the neuroscience that's going on and the more traditional, you know, psychiatry that is attuned to, you know, symptoms of behavior, of speech, of cultural attitude, if you think we could ever get to, you know, a point among the scientists where they think, they start lobbying, they think, let's make the science the standard of deciding if somebody has a mental illness rather than cultural notions, even though everybody else is saying, listen, you know, you have to have things that we call cultural mixed into the judgment of whether somebody will finally do a certain sort of act. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I really thank you for bringing this up. And I mean, I don't profess to have any definite answers about what to do. One thing, though, is I have read some accounts of people with, you know, mental illness or secondhand accounts and stuff like that. And sometimes, again, with like, again, this can't be generalized to all accounts, but some people, say with the bipolar disorder, for instance, was it An Unquiet Mind? I'm not sure if it was in that one, where she says, you know, would I go back to the beginning and choose not to have this illness? Or another case was, should I have children if they have a 25, 50% chance of having it? And she said, I think it was her, maybe it was another one I read, that she would, you know, she would go back and do it because the suffering involved in the mental illness, again, this is bipolar disorder, this isn't like, you know, this isn't antisocial personality or something, but yeah, but she said she would because the suffering sort of makes life so much more meaningful or deep. So again, I mean, I can't really answer towards the whole sociopathy because that is a whole different thing when someone's out, you know, killing other people or taking advantage of other people. But with some mental illnesses, there's a sense of like, maybe we shouldn't over-treat them because in a sense, a certain degree of suffering enriches life. And it's our sort of a fear of suffering that in a sense it can become highly like problematic and almost neurotic even. I mean, increasing in certain ways. So I don't know. I mean, I can't really answer the question about mass murderers. That would be a difficult one, you know, but I don't know. Yeah.
So you started out talking about using fMRI scans to as a biomarker for disorders, and maybe we'll get to a point where just simply doing some neuroimaging on a task will show us abnormalities in brain connectivity that will then allow us to make some diagnoses with some precision. And then you discussed Husserl and the apodictic, and you focused on the period of the logical investigations, particularly, but then you went to later points as well. Oh, by the way, I wanted to say, a very, very stimulating talk. So my concern is that we proceed with more certainty than we really have. And I would say that both with regard to biomarkers, and even though there's a tremendous effort to try to find these biomarkers, whether it's going to be through scanning, blood tests, or whatever it's going to be, we are at very early steps in all this, as you pointed out as well. I think with Husserl, we have to be very careful as well, because apodictic necessity is something very strong, and a lot of what he studies are not absolute findings. And in fact, one of the great things about Husserl's own depth is that he continues to revise, as did Freud as well, continues to think about, revise, ruminates, sometimes maybe even ruminates too much by doing the analyses over and over again, the same thing about the thing and the variations of the adumbrations, as you pointed out, and how to find the essence and all that and so on. So we have to be careful about a method that claims absolute apodicticity in a realm of subjectivity. Now what the scan does, it's going to reflect subjectivity no matter what. The scan doesn't show just the task, but it shows the neural correlates of the person's experience of the task subjectively. And what we need to do, I think, is start to go to study the subjective experience of patients, of their symptoms, and start to do, and Michael Schwartz, I believe, because we've done a lot of collaborative work on this, agrees that we start to do taxonomies on the basis of the fine-grained phenomenology that patients report. We're editing a book on this right now called Phenomenological Neuropsychiatry, How Patient Experience Bridges Clinic with Clinical Neuroscience. And so we're feeling the missing link here in the search for, let's say, correlations of scans. Well, we have to know what's being experienced subjectively, and a big problem was talking about default mode networks and making inferences about default mode networks when we're not really sure exactly what the person's experiencing subjectively until we debrief them, until we ask them, what are you experiencing? And admittedly, there's a tension because patients can't always say what they're experiencing.
Yeah, I definitely agree. We shouldn't overemphasize kind of the essential apodictic bits in Husserl. One thing, though, having been said, though, I mean, so one of the things that Husserl does is it's sort of self-verifying. So it's a sense he's right if we can agree with him, in a sense, because it's like the testing of Husserl's hypothesis is not one where you go into a lab and test the hypothesis there, but it's insofar as we sort of assent to his propositions ourselves. So one thing, I think that the content of the apodictic bits of phenomenology are very, very small and very, very limited. And it's not like, I don't think Husserl will ever say, it's apodictically true that a table has to have like 4 legs or something like that. It's not about sort of, as we were talking about before, like content per se, but kind of more like forms. And so I think something like, say, intentionality of thought. So when I read Husserl, I think, yeah, intentionality, that makes total sense. In my experience, I'm always thinking about things. And so I think in that, so if we just take like that one, it's like, if we can find someone who can think without thinking about, then we've contradicted Husserl, and we've shown that that's not an apodictic structure. And so, my question then is not like actual experiences, whether or not, you know, all human beings can feel, I don't know, love or something like that, or even empathy. I think Husserl's account of empathy is very, very thin, so that it's like, it's not, doesn't mean like, say, feeling someone else's love or something like that. So I think with Husserl's apodicticity, we can always test it ourselves if we think, okay, Husserl's right or Husserl's wrong based on our own experience. So then I can say, if I'm reading Husserl and he says, for instance, it's apodictically true that everyone sees blue or something like that. And I can say, well, that's not true because I don't see blue all the time. Or it's apodictically true that everyone distinguishes between hard and soft. And you think, well, that's not necessarily true. But I think with other things like adumbrations of perception, like I don't know anyone who can, I don't know how it would be possible to perceive an external object at all its moments in history and all its aspects simultaneously. I think that's kind of and then another one he says is like the world is always sort of fleeting, so the world is always more than sort of what we can perceive, and it can always be different. So I don't know how we could have a world where it could never be different from what we expect. So I mean, I think they're just like maybe a handful of apodictic bits, but I don't know. I mean, I have to think about this a lot more, but right now, at least, in my point in life, I'm kind of, I find this interesting and slightly convincing. Because I mean, for a long time, I was opposed to kind of finding essences and things like that. And I'm still not really in favor of finding like essences of things. But I think some of these structures are very prevalent and yeah. So I think people like Leslie Kolakowski in his Cassira lectures, Husserl's Search for Certitude. So I think there he kind of gets Husserl wrong because he thinks that Husserl's after too much certitude. Husserl's after like the certitude that comes when we think about like blue or something like that. But I think he kind of confuses a bit the apodictic versus the adequate evidence in Husserl a bit. But I don't know. I mean, that's an open question for interpretation too. But it's definitely a good point though you raised.
Just one comment that I think that Binswanger, in his debates with Jaspers, actually, in his first stage, refers to Husserl. Mm-hmm. And in fact, Husserl's theory of essences as a way of applying it to psychiatric disorders. And then finally, in his late phase, he returns to a Husserlian approach. And it's very instructive because I think he does some very, very interesting things with Husserl to look, for example, at delusions. And Blankenberg did that as well with a failure of perspective taking and this sort of thing.
So before, we had agreed that we'd keep the formal part of our discussions to 2 hours, and we're a little bit past 2 hours. But I did want to ask, before I close things, whether anybody else in the audience would like to raise a comment or follow up formally. Otherwise, thank you for watching, thank you for being here and listening, and we'll continue the conversation informally. Okay, thank you then. Good night.